Hey, so I realized that the intro that I filmed for this video didn't save on the camera, so I'm re-recording this. Basically, the topic for today's lecture is starting a new unit, which is focusing on different concepts of justification and how justification structures itself. Think of like a building or a foundation of support, and justification is that building or foundation of support for our knowledge. So today we're starting with Alvin Goldman's piece on reliabilism, which is one account of justification. In a couple of weeks, we'll see different accounts of justification that are rival accounts. And we'll also see different accounts independently of these accounts of what justification is, how justification builds on itself to sort of support our structure of knowledge and justification. Starting kind of non-chronologically with an account by Alvin Goldman, where he's going to end up presenting his theory, which we might call reliabilism. It's an account of what it is that counts as justification. His paper is titled, "What is Justified Belief?" and he published it in 1979. Goldman says that he just wants to explain the ordinary notion of justification. He's not trying to come up with a really esoteric theory that doesn't match up with what we usually say, I suppose. The paper is quite technical, so it can be difficult to get through, but I'll try in this lecture to distill sort of the main concepts that are most relevant for a general understanding of the problem of justification. So one main thing that's already happening in this paper is that we're trying to get clear on whether justification is something that we need to know about in order to be justified. Goldman calls the rival account, in this respect, the Cartesian account. So the Cartesian is someone, according to Goldman, who thinks that in order to be justified in believing something, I need to know that I'm justified. And this is intuitive if you think about like cases of reasoning or deduction, for example. Like if you're a mathematician and you believe a particular mathematical theorem, you'd better also know the reasons why you believe it if you are a good mathematician, right? You should be able to do the proofs for a lot of the theorems that you might work on or that you might rely on in order to prove the things that you're trying to prove. And needing to know the source of your justification seems important to the Cartesian. But Goldman differs in this respect. He thinks that that standard of justification is just a little bit too high. Why? Well, he just thinks that there are some less complex cognitive operations and less complex creatures in the world that might still have justification for the beliefs that they form, even though they might not know the very source of their justification. So think here, for example, of babies and squirrels. It's a favorite example of mine. Or cats and dogs. They form beliefs as they move around the world, but they form beliefs without necessarily being able to say or know about why they are justified in forming the beliefs they do, right? If a dog sees a squirrel, they might have dog thoughts about squirrels and have dog beliefs about squirrels if we attribute beliefs to dogs in the first place. But they won't know how to think about their own perception. We don't think that that's necessary for them actually being justified in believing that there's a squirrel over there. I can smell it. I can see it, right? If I'm a dog, I know there's a squirrel there. I don't need to know why I know, if that makes sense. So we'll get to the nitty-gritty of these two distinctions later in the semester, but for now, just understand that Goldman is placing himself on the side of justification here that doesn't take it to be a very high standard. It's an accessible standard. It's an ordinary standard. I can be justified in believing things even though I don't know the basis for my justification. So what makes these two different accounts still agree about stuff? Well, the thing that they do agree about at the core, at the bottom, is that justification is sort of an evaluative term. It's a term of appraisal. When you say you have justification for a belief, you're saying that there's something good about the belief. Both Goldman and the Cartesian think that there is a positive feature of justification. It's a good thing to have. It's something that ennobles, if you will, a belief and gives it a special status. So what's going on in Goldman's paper? What is a justified belief? One of the things that's going on is that he's gesturing at certain sorts of views that you might have about justification, certain intuitive views, certain views that other philosophers might have proposed for how to understand justification, and he's sort of showing how they don't work. And I won't go through the specifics of each of these views that he rejects in the paper. I might give an example or two. But the core idea here is that he's sort of making room for his account. He's going to try to say why his account is better. So I'm going to flip the script a little bit, and I'll start by explaining what his account is, and then I'll explain why he thinks it's better than these other accounts that he rejects. So Goldman's proposed account is called reliabilism, and he describes it as follows, quote, "The justificational status of a belief is a function of the reliability of the process or processes that cause it, where, as a first approximation, reliability consists in the tendency of a process to produce beliefs that are true rather than false." Basically what we're saying is, on Goldman's account, a belief is justified if it's produced by what he calls a reliable process. And a reliable process is one that has a tendency to produce true beliefs. So one example that's sometimes given, one analogy, is you are justified, for example, in believing that your gas tank is full if the indicator on your car, the gas indicator on your car, shows that it is full, right? And why is it that you're justified in believing that? Well, because the gas indicator, if it's connected properly, reliably shows whether or not the tank is full or not. The gas indicator is a reliable indicator, right? It has a tendency to show that the gas tank is full if and only if the gas tank is full. Why? Well, in part it's because the level on the indicator is caused by, it's affected by the amount of gas in the tank. There's sort of a process by which they're connected. And so we think of reliable mental processes that Goldman wants to pick out as the processes that justify as being similarly causally connected to the world. So suppose I perceive this agenda, this book. I am justified in believing that there's an agenda here if and only if generally my perception under good conditions like this has a tendency to produce beliefs in me only when they actually correspond to things that are there, right? So I only believe there are agendas in front of me, usually when there are actually agendas in front of me. And you could say that that's true of my perceptual system. In most situations, my perceptual system only tells me information about the world when it actually corresponds to things that are happening in the world. My perception might be described as a reliable process on Goldman's account. One cool thing about this account is that it allows for gradations of justification. So what that means is that I might have beliefs that are more justified at certain times or less justified at certain times, depending on the frequency with which the process produces true beliefs. And this makes sense, right? So sometimes I'm in a bad set of conditions and the process that I'm using to form beliefs is just not as reliable. It doesn't produce as accurate a depiction of the world. Like suppose I'm driving and it's foggy, right? Under foggy conditions, my vision is less accurate than it usually would be. And in that case, Goldman would just say, the beliefs that I form as a result of my vision are less reliable. They're less justified. Similarly, if I'm in like really, really good conditions or I'm using like super good tools, they're like really precise, then actually my beliefs might be even more justified than they regularly are because I'm using a more reliable process. This is relevant to scientific processes of determining what conclusions are accurate or make sense to believe because, right, there are certain types of experimental methods that are more reliable. They produce results that we have more confidence in. And if that's true, if we should have more confidence in certain types of experimental methods, then those experimental methods produce more justification. We have more reason for believing the result of experiments that meet those conditions. So in a little bit more constrained circumstances, right, beliefs from quick visual scanning, right, if I just sort of glance quickly and I form a belief, that'll tend to be less reliable than if I have time to sort of sit and contemplate my environment and scan carefully across the room, then I'll have a more reliable belief. Or in a different context, if I use an inferential process on the basis of a random sampling of events, right, or a very varied sampling of events, that inference will tend to be more reliable in my conclusion than an inference based on non-random or non-varied samples. This brings up the question, how reliable does my process have to be in order to confer a justification? On Goldman's account, it's okay if we don't have a concrete line for this, if we don't have a straight answer. The gradation of reliability means that there's also a gradation of justification, and there might just be many points at which we have justification in some sense, but that process isn't reliable enough to always produce true beliefs. Goldman thinks it's compatible with having justification that sometimes the process produces false beliefs. So there will be reliable processes that sometimes get it wrong, and that's just sort of unfortunate. So it'll turn out that a justified process, a reliable process, won't always produce a true belief. Goldman thinks that's okay. Goldman notes that there's a restriction on his account that we need to add. Basically, the problem is that there are some beliefs that I might form reliably, processes that might be reliable processes. Think of like deductive inferences, for example, pretty reliable, right? But they won't yield true beliefs if the premises that are used for the inference are false. And so we'll have a reliable process that we don't think gives us reason to believe the conclusion is true in the same sense. And so Goldman defines another form of reliability that he calls conditional reliability. Conditional reliability used for these types of cases is when one that you have if a reasonable number of the beliefs that result from the process are true given true input beliefs to the process, right? So now we have conditional reliability of inference, that is a reason to believe that a conclusion is true if the premises that I put into the inference are true, and not just in every case. So not every use of inference will be a case in which I have reason to believe the conclusion is true. It'll just be the ones in which I have true premises, or premises that I have reason to believe are true as well. Okay, so what's a reason to believe reliabilism instead of one of these other theories that he could have endorsed, but actually spends a lot of the paper showing doesn't work? Well, Goldman diagnoses a shared problem with some of the rival accounts. And some of the rival accounts include, for example, a notion of justification as indubitability, so you can't doubt it. A notion of justification as self-evidence, so something is justified if it's just self-evident, if as soon as you contemplate it, it just seems true. He also dismisses an account of justification on which it is self-presenting. So it's like self-intimating in a way. He debunks that one. And finally, he also rejects an idea of justification around infallibility or incorrigibility, according to which necessarily for any belief, if you believe it, then it is true. And that seems to be like Descartes' account of a private internal belief that I have, like in the meditations, in meditation 1 and meditation 2. Certain beliefs that I have seem incorrigible, like it's just impossible that they're false. Like the belief that I exist, right? Anytime that I have that belief, it's just true, right? But those conditions aren't very good conditions of justification, thinks Goldman. And why not? Here's the shared problem that they have on his view. The problem is that all of these different kind of candidates for justification, for clauses for justification, all still allow for a faulty belief-forming process to cause the belief. Goldman thinks that they're all liable to the same sort of counterexample. And the counterexample is one in which there's sort of a faulty process that causes you to have the belief, even though it fits the description of the justification condition. So even if the belief meets the conditions given, it's formed actually by a faulty process. It's caused by a faulty process, and that's the reason why we think it's not justified in the first place. So Goldman thinks that the way to correct all of these bad accounts of justification is to include a causation condition, basically. So he says, correct principles of justified belief must be principles that make causal requirements. So there's got to be a requirement on a belief being justified that it be caused in a certain way. And he thinks that by affixing this causal principle to our theory of justification, we'll get out of all of these like messy examples where it seems like a belief meets the conditions for justification given before, but it just happens to be false, right? So all of these rival accounts are accounts in which like someone could hit you over the head and you form the belief, and so it meets the conditions anyway in the way that's specified, but we don't think it's justified because someone hit you over the head, right? Or there's like an evil demon who causes you to believe a thing, or who fixes the world so that you believe a thing even if it doesn't seem like a good reason to believe it. So Goldman says, thus, the correct principles of justified belief must be principles that make causal requirements. The causal requirements are actually what lead us to think that certain beliefs are justified or not, according to Goldman. And he gets this idea by thinking about like regular cases. Certain types of causes for a belief, we think, don't confer a justification. There's sort of bad reasons to believe things. What are examples of bad reasons to believe things? There are things like confused reasoning. If you're really confused, or if you're like drunk when you're trying to reason about something, we have a tendency to think you're going to form bad beliefs. That's not a reason. That's not a condition on which you should keep the belief that you formed because it's not going to be justified. Another example is wishful thinking. Sometimes you form beliefs because you want it to be the case that something is true, right? You try to manifest it in the world. Like you really wish that this person that you have a crush on also had a crush on you, and so your wishful thinking makes you sort of read into all of their actions and believe that maybe there are reasons why they like you too. You don't actually have justification for believing they have a crush on you in this case. It's just kind of your strong desire that they like you that's coloring your experience of the world. And so that's a case where you want to say, no, your belief is a bad belief. You should give up the belief that maybe they have a crush on you. Another case in which we think you formed a belief badly is if you are relying on your emotional attachment to something. It's not in my emotional interest to believe that I'm a deeply flawed human being. And so anytime someone corrects me, man, that's like emotionally damaging. So I have a tendency to reject, right? I have a tendency to find reasons to reject anything that's flawed about me because it's painful, right? Those are cases in which I'm forming beliefs about myself and my own abilities that don't seem justified. I should give up those beliefs because they're based on my emotional attachment to my own goodness or nobility, not because they're based on like good evidence that I'm a good person or that I'm right a lot of the time. Here's another example of when I might form a belief, but it's not justified if I'm forming beliefs based on guesswork or just a hunch, right? Most of the time when I form beliefs on the basis of hunches, it's not a good idea, as much as, TV makes us believe otherwise, right? There's always that character in like the crime drama that like gets a hunch, or they like go on the basis of like a feeling and they get it right and like, wow, it's marvelous. They just have such good instincts.
Do you believe in fate? Absolutely not. Ludicrous.
But usually we don't think that like forming beliefs on the basis of pure instinct is that reliable a process. It's often a bad idea to always go on hunches. You usually want to rely at least a little bit on your own rationale, right, on your reasoning. And so if you always form beliefs on the basis of hunches, that's not going to be pretty good for forming beliefs, right? We won't want to trust your belief forming process. Finally, another case in which it seems like you don't have justification if you use this too much is if you form bad generalizations. Like if the reason that you believe something is just you have these stereotypes about people, that's not a good process. We should probably not form beliefs on the basis of processes like that. So no guesswork, no hunches, no emotional reasons for believing, no wishful thinking, and no confused reasoning. Those are all bad reasons to have a belief. Basically, Goldman thinks all of these bad things that cause belief have one thing in common, which is that they have a tendency to produce false beliefs. They're not reliable, basically. And so the thing that unifies all of the cases in which we think you're not justified in forming a belief is that there's a causal problem. The processes that have caused your belief don't have a tendency to produce true beliefs. On the other hand, there are a lot of processes that do have a tendency to produce true beliefs, and those are the very same processes that we tend to think confer a justification. What are examples of that? Well, a standard perceptual process. My vision, my sense of my tactile sense, my hearing, my smell, my taste, maybe my smell and my taste less than the other ones because it's not quite as precise, but most of my sense perception has a tendency to produce good, true beliefs, right? And because of that tendency, it confers justification on Goldman's view. Another kind of process that he thinks is pretty good is remembering. Some people have really good memories, we like to think. Some people are really good at remembering names. I'm not one of those people, but maybe you know someone who is. There are certain people also with like photographic memories, if you like, and those people might also have pretty good memories. Modern psychology tells us that maybe actually our memories are not as reliable as might have been believed when Goldman was writing this paper. So that one might be a little fuzzy, but let's suppose if you did have a really good truth-preserving memory process, memory-forming process, then that would be a process that Goldman thinks is reliable, produces justification. Certainly it would be good if we could rely on some of our memory, right? When we're taking a test and we've had to do a lot of memorization. It would be bad if our memorization was just generally unreliable, because then we'd be really bad at all of those tests. Another case in which we have justification because the causes are reliable in producing true belief is good reasoning. That's reasoning that has a tendency to produce true beliefs. And one of the things we want to do as epistemologists is figure out what sort of reasoning that is, right? And do more of that kind of reasoning. Finally, Goldman thinks that introspection is also a process that has a tendency to produce true beliefs. And that is also something that has been questioned recently in sort of psychology, but we do tend to think that introspection is good at telling us information about certain kinds of internal processes, right? Like, surely I know better than anyone else when I'm in pain. So in summary, the processes that Goldman likes all share the feature that they generally have a tendency to produce true beliefs or accurate beliefs. And the processes that we don't like, the things that we do that don't produce justification, according to Goldman, share the characteristic that they have a tendency to produce false beliefs, or at least don't have a tendency to produce true and accurate beliefs. So it's the causal connection that matters for Goldman. The fact that the causal connection is what makes my beliefs justified or not justified also explains why I don't necessarily need to know the reason why I'm justified when I am justified on Goldman's account. Because, if my process that I'm relying on is reliable, then the things it produces will be good things, right? The beliefs that it produces will be good beliefs, whether or not I know that the process that's producing the good beliefs is a good process. It just matters that the process is reliable. So my perception will have a tendency to produce true beliefs, and that's the reason why my perceptual belief is justified. I don't need to necessarily know that my perception has that tendency. I just need to be using a process with such a tendency, if that makes sense. On the other hand, the Cartesian account doesn't have a causal clause, right? On the Cartesian account, there's kind of a direct relationship I have to have. I need to have a grasp of the source of my justification, and I need to be able to always give a rationale for why I'm justified in order to count as being justified. And that means that if I can't tell you the reason why my perceptual beliefs are reliable, then my perceptual beliefs won't be justified for the Cartesian. Goldman, though, is more on the side of someone like G.E. Moore. He does think that my perceptual processes are generally reliable and generally they confer justification. In closing, since I'm not going to go over any of the specifics of the rival accounts, we'll get to see some rival accounts next week and the week after. I'll go over some objections to Goldman's view in particular. Some of them are kind of interesting. So here's one objection to Goldman's view. It's the question about whether introspective beliefs about private mental events, so my beliefs about whether I'm in pain, for example, my beliefs that I'm angry, my beliefs that I'm hungry, things like that, whether they are justified due to their causal history. Why would I wonder that? Well, if I'm a Cartesian, right, there's a sense in which I think that my private mental events already justify me in believing them, because as soon as I have a thought, in a sense for the Cartesian, I know that I'm having a thought. So for the Cartesian, there isn't like a temporal separation between my having a thought and my awareness that I have a thought. But for Goldman, these two things are distinct. There is kind of a thought, and then the thought itself causes me to have a thought about my thought. And that's how I believe that I have a thought, if that makes sense. For the Cartesian, when I'm thinking about my own mental states, it feels like my mental states are immediately revealed to me. If I'm in pain, for the Cartesian, the pain is just self-evident. There doesn't need to be like a second mental state. Oh, I'm in pain. It's just the pain is the mental state. Oh, I'm in pain. And so there isn't a cause. The pain doesn't then cause a belief for the Cartesian. I don't need to separately form a belief about the state that I'm in. It just, I am in the state. But Goldman responds that introspective belief about that private mental event, about that pain, is justified because of a causal history. It's not sort of self-evident and that's why it's justified. It's justified because actually, in Goldman's opinion, the pain causes a separate belief to be formed. And that process that causes the belief to be formed about the fact that I'm in pain is a reliable process. It does tend to produce beliefs only when I'm actually in pain. And so Goldman thinks that there is like a time lag between my belief and the pain. They're not the same state. So there is kind of a metaphysical, ontological commitment here about mental states. It's interesting. Another interesting objection goes like this. All right, Goldman, so you say that all of the reliable processes, the ones that have a tendency to produce true beliefs, right, are the justified ones. What if I'm in a world or like a universe where there's a benevolent demon who has a tendency to make people's wishful thinking come true? So almost any time that someone's like, oh man, wouldn't it be nice if, and the demon just sort of, anytime anybody had a wishful thought like that, just made it true. That would be a case in which my wishful thinking reliably produced a true belief, because the demon sort of helps make it be the case. The objection goes, wait, Goldman, that fits your definition of a justified belief, but is that really a case where we want to say that the person is justified? And Goldman has a couple of different responses to this objection, all of which are independently interesting. So one response is, well, maybe yeah. Maybe in that world, that process, wishful thinking, is a reliable process. We don't live in that world, so wishful thinking doesn't work around here, but maybe it does for a person who lives in benevolent demon land. That's one answer you could give. Maybe you think that makes sense. But here's another two answers you can give that qualify the statement and say, oh, okay, maybe wishful thinking isn't justified. And one reason you might say that, even in this world, is you might think that what matters is that the reliable processes are somehow natural. They're not kind of a function of some artificial intervention, like is the case with this benevolent demon. So it's not the case that wishful thinking usually produces true beliefs, even in that world. It's just that there's like a demon who's kind of messing with the natural order. And so the way to fix that would be to add a clause to our reliability condition that says something like, only naturally reliable processes confer justification. Here's a third response that Goldman could give to this sort of objection. He could say, well, maybe that case is not a case in which you have justification, because what matters is relativizing to our world and our conditions. So that process, even in that other world, isn't reliable, and it's not justification conferring because it's not reliable here, the place where we live. And so we just say of that case, that's not really a justified belief because it's not a case in which it's justified here. Which of these responses do you think makes the most sense for Goldman to give in order to defend his view? I think all of them have something positive to say for them. I might be interested in a case where there are just certain worlds where there are different sorts of processes that are justified processes to use to form beliefs. It maybe does make sense that your justification depends on the environment that you're in. If that's true though, does that produce any problems for the brain in a vat scenario? There's a home exercise for you. I'll leave you to think about that. All right, the final objection to Goldman's theory, the reliabilist account of justification, is the following, and it's a good objection. Well, suppose that you have a particular belief. I'll take a case, like I seem to remember wearing a yellow dress on a certain occasion when I was a kid. I seem to remember walking on grass barefoot and wearing this yellow dress, for example. Let's suppose that's a memory that I have. So I believe that at a certain point I was wearing a yellow dress and I was walking on grass. But my parents have given me all sorts of reasons to believe that I was never barefoot as a child. They were very, very conscientious about always having me in shoes or always being carried by somebody. Maybe they let me go barefoot indoors, but they would never ever let me walk around outside on the grass, and like my mom has an aversion to the color yellow or something, and I know about this. So I have good reasons not to believe that I ever wore a yellow dress and I walked on grass. Now, suppose that my memory actually is reliable, and this actually did happen, and I do have a memory of it that is a true memory. But the information around me, the evidence that I have from what my parents say, gives me all sorts of reasons not to believe the thing that I believe. So we feel like that case might be a case in which my belief was formed by a reliable process, namely my memory, but we don't think I'm justified in believing the content of my memory, that I was wearing a yellow dress and walking on grass. Why? Well, because I have reasons not to believe it. Wouldn't that be a case in which the belief meets Goldman's conditions, but we don't say the belief is justified? Goldman suggests that we can just add a new principle here that says that you have justification only if there's no available process that is reliable that could have resulted in you not believing the thing that you believe. And this case, this example, is a case in which I do have an available process that's a reliable process most of the time, that should maybe have resulted in my not believing the thing that I believe. So maybe if my parents are usually reliable in their testimony and I can believe the things that they say, then I should rely on their testimony, and in this case, rely on their testimony over my memory. Even though my memory in this case is actually reliable and I just have bad information from my parents, but it's like one of the few cases in which they're wrong. And so it doesn't have justification, all things considered, if that makes sense. So in the end, Goldman's theory makes a lot of sense, and there are a lot of good reasons to believe it, to buy it as our theory of justification. It does a lot of things right. First of all, it does try to explain kind of our ordinary concepts of when we think someone is justified and someone is not justified, and it links it to sort of processes that we might use, rules that we might use that are good rules most of the time because they have a tendency to cause true beliefs or accurate beliefs. It sort of explains what we think is good about good science and bad about bad science in a lot of cases. And it also allows that simpler creatures or beings than us, like small children, animals maybe, why they might have justified beliefs even though they can't supply the reasons why they have those justified beliefs. One thing I haven't covered in this lecture today is whether Goldman's account survives a Gettier counterexample. So it might be worth bringing up again in class, a fake barn country case. Is that a case where we find that Goldman's analysis can't get out of the Gettier counterexample? And maybe that doesn't matter. Maybe we just give up on the analysis of knowledge and the only thing we care about is coming up with a plausible account of justification, even if we know that truth plus belief plus justification just doesn't always produce knowledge. We know that there's a gap, and maybe that's unfillable. Does this theory of justification make sense for us to adopt? We might have to wait to see what the other kind of main contenders I'm presenting are, but for the time being, I think that reliability is like a pretty good notion to use in day-to-day life.
So you can start assessing too whether or not the processes you use to form beliefs, to form conclusions about certain topics are reliable processes or not. Here's an example. If you form beliefs on the basis of Facebook posts very, very often, then probably you're not forming reliably true beliefs. People post all kinds of stuff on Facebook. This kind of analysis allows us to ask what sorts of news outlets maybe, what sorts of types of information, what sorts of people have a tendency to reliably produce good information, true information that we can ourselves then rely on when we form our beliefs. And if those sources are reliable sources of information, then we can rely on them ourselves.
Thanks so much for tuning in, everybody. See you next time.